Welcome to another episode of Blazin, Grazin, and Other Wild Things. Today's episode, I think we're going to visit about stocking rates with cattle grazing, which is that's a foreign term to a lot of people, right? Stocking or stocking rate. What is that? How do we do that, and what is it?
Yeah, it's a good time of year to talk about that because I like to encourage folks to kind of reevaluate where their stocking rates are at midsummer. Here in Oklahoma, we grow most of our warm season forage, that's our predominant base for our native pastures in May and June. So July is a good time to kind of reevaluate where we're at, how much we've grown. We can't really make up for it if we don't grow as much as normal, even though we usually get that little bump of rain in August and September. So it's a good time of year to think about how you're doing on stocking rates. I think for some folks, it's just, well, how do you even calculate it? What do you do to calculate it? Do you want to start there?
Yeah, well, I think probably the best question to start off with is define what stocking rate is, because really and truly, I'm serious. Yeah. I grew up in this state, and I've worked with landowners for decades, and most people do not understand what is a stocking rate. They just know, well, I just run this many cows because that's what it'll do. Yeah. That's a good point, John. So when we talk about a stocking rate, we're talking about a number of animals on a unit of area, number of acres, for a length of time. So often that length of time part is what's left off. And so I see a lot of discussions and stuff on social media where people are talking about, well, can I graze this many animals on this many acres? And without knowing how long those animals are going to be there, that information is pretty much irrelevant. So you've got to know how long, because obviously grazing animals for 8 months is going to have a completely different impact on the plants than grazing them for 4 months or for 2 months or whatever. So knowing what a stocking rate is that's appropriate depends on how long those animals are going to graze. So that's the first thing. If you share information about how many animals you're grazing for us on a specific area, that's called a grazing density, and that's just a snapshot in time of what you're grazing at that specific time, but that's actually not a stocking rate. So if you had twice as many animals on the same unit of area, so let's use 80 acres. So if you were grazing 10 animals on 80 acres year round, the stocking rate is going to be the same as if you were grazing twice as many animals on that area for half the length of time. So there's differences in the terminology. The most important thing is that you include the length of time.
Yeah, you could graze a lot of animals on an acre for 2 hours, for instance.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah, for sure. But you could not do that for a year.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's I think where people kind of get a little bit confused, because some people will be like, well, I can graze this many animals on this area, but they don't say how long. And it's like, well, of course you can. How long are you doing that? So knowing that is important. Okay.
And so what are the benefits of having a proper stocking rate?
Yeah.
And what can we see or what is that? That's
Yeah. So as a range scientist, someone that's really studying the plant community, that is the biggest long-term benefit. So if you have a properly stocked pasture, you're going to have sustainability of that plant community. And the goal is to keep the dominant forage species as healthy as possible for the long term, right? And so what can sometimes happen is that people will be able to graze heavily for a number of years, particularly when it's raining. And their plant community is doing fine, the animals are doing fine, everyone's chugging along, and then you get into a drought year and the whole thing falls apart. And so here in Oklahoma, what typically happens if you're pushing the stocking rate hard, if you're grazing with more animals than you should, year after year after year is that the dominant tall grass species decrease, and then you end up with more short grass species. And so your overall productivity of your pasture will start to decline over time. So, a pasture that maybe grew, 3,600 pounds or, even up to 4,000 pounds per acre is going to just start to decrease in the pounds per acre that it produces as you push that grazing system. So you'll have more short grass species if you're lucky. Otherwise, you'll just have a lot more forbs that have all sorts of different secondary compounds that the cattle don't necessarily prefer all year round. So those are for the rangeland, that's one consequence. Another consequence is that you can have animals grazing really hard and along streams. They'll hit that vegetation more, particularly when the grasses in the uplands and stuff are less desirable. So early spring and fall, when everything starts to be more different so they'll graze that hard, and so then eventually your streams start to become eroded and decrease in quality, and the quality of the water in there is declining because it has more sediment. So those are the kinds of things.
What does improper stocking rate do? What does it do to animal performance?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even if you're running cow, what would it do to that cow? What would it potentially do to that calf? Is there any consequences, for having running too many animals?
Yeah. So that's something that range scientists have studied for quite a while. It's interesting. There's a really good old kind of synthesis paper that tried to look at all of the research that people had done across the West. And at that point, he found 25 studies where people had done that in lots of different states. And so some of that research was done here in Oklahoma and in our neighboring states, in Texas and Kansas and New Mexico and stuff. And so, and what they found was that the cows, you had for the cow-calf operations, the cow breed up was lower. So you had more cows that came up open every year. On the calves, you had lower weaning weights on those calves when you were pushing the stocking rate and doing a heavier utilization rate on those pastures. On the pastures where they were grazing stockers, they had lower individual animal gain. And so I think what's happening, I know what's happening is people, they have a set, number of acres that they are managing or own, and they're trying to maximize the number of animals that are grazing on there. And so they're like, well, if I've got this many calves, I'm going to make more money. Or if I've grazed this many stockers, I'm going to make more money. Well, each individual animal has lower performance under a heavy stocking rate than a moderate or light. And so that's what they found with those studies, is when you look at it kind of across the western states, that as you push your utilization to more like 60%, where you're taking as much as 60% of that vegetation every year, individual animal performance decreases. So you have lower reproductive performance, but lower weight gains as well. And then when you back off of that and you try to be more moderate with 50% use rate, total use, cattle and other uses that happen on rangeland. So that's, wildlife uses, just anything that's, part of that plant material is just being, is being incorporated back into the soil, all the things. So, but at a half use rate, that's where you're kind of optimizing your individual animal performance and gain per acre. So gain per animal and gain per acre is great in the middle. At a lighter use, you get better gain. You get the best gain per animal, but not the best gain per acre. So at the heavy use, you get a better gain per acre. So you can maximize both of those in the middle, and so that's animal performance wise and net return. That's what we know from the research. Now, some folks think, well, if I do this type of grazing or that type of grazing, I can make up for a heavier stocking rate. And the reality is we just can't do that, right? When we use a rotational system, there's research that we know we can bump up plant performance because of that, a little bit of that additional rest, but it's moderate. It's less than 10% increase in productivity, and it's mostly due to just shifts in plant community. So we get more of the really productive grasses, but a 10% increase is really moderate. And so we don't get, a doubling or a tripling of grass growth in response. We also can, with a moderate rotational system, we can bump up how the grazing efficiency that the animals do. So like when we're moving animals around, there's a certain amount of waste in the vegetation just because of trampling and urinating and all of that stuff. So when we use a moderate rotational system, we can bump that up by 5%, the efficiency, how much is making it into them versus how much is being lost. When you get to the really high density systems, though, you actually end up having more waste, more trampling. So the cows are consuming less of the vegetation with a really high density system. So anyway, it's all dependent on how you're grazing, right? And so moderate stocking rates are really the ideal for most of our systems that are adapted to grazing. If you get into some of the really far western states, there's some ecosystems out there that are not very grazing adapted. But here in Oklahoma, luckily, there was a long history of bison, elk, deer, all sorts of things that were grazing. So our plants are really grazing and fire adapted.
Yep, and fire adapted.
Yeah.
Yeah, you talked about some rotational grazing, but really true. And there's nothing wrong with good old year-round continuous grazing.
Yeah.
A lot of times some people think that, that's so detrimental to the land and everything, but it's not at the proper stocking rate.
Yes. So there's been a lot of research kind of comparing different grazing systems at multiple stocking rates, right? And all of those studies are in, every time the results come back the same. If you have the correct stocking rate, that is by far the most important thing. So you can't make up for the incorrect stocking rate by doing some type of rotation. You've got to get the right stocking rate. And we have other ways of, the thing that most people are using stocking rates for is really managing distribution. And there's lots of ways to manage grazing distribution. I don't know if that's where it sounded like you were about to say something.
No, but no, that's a perfect thing is, people, that's the sad thing. You do get people that they see blades of grass that aren't utilized, and it's like, oh, we need more livestock on there.
Yeah.
And it's not, and I think that goes back to it's our human nature, and maybe you can explain it too even better about the utilization. Again, I know that's what a lot of the rotational or those grazing, designer grazing systems. They're kind of the flavor of the week club too, as a point of this different grazing system is for making uniform utilization, and they want everything to look like a mowed lawn. They don't want anything sticking up, whereas really and truly in all benefits, if it says 6 inch, somebody says, oh, we need to utilize this to 6 inch stubble height, graze it down to 6 inches. Everybody pictures the entire 160 acre quarter section being 6 inches tall grass. And what it really means is there's some areas that are going to be grazed down really short, and there's some areas going to be 12 inches tall or taller, but it's going to average 6 inches. And then that goes back to wildlife benefits. where again we've got this hodgepodge mosaic of short areas, tall areas that are needed for nesting, brooding, all that kind of different stuff, instead of the perfect mowed lawn, manicured, where everything's utilized.
Yeah, I think the idea about grazing and utilization has developed a lot, right? And so I think originally the idea was like, well, I can take 50% of the plant every year, so I'm going to get as close to that take as possible. And so I'm going to try to graze it as evenly as possible. And the reality is it's nearly impossible. Even in a Bermuda monoculture, animals graze differently in certain areas than they do in other areas. And so to try to get to that even use, people went to heavier and heavier, higher and higher stock densities, because you can get more even grazing the further down you graze. And so the idea was like, well, I'm going to use it evenly to the ground for a short period of time, and then I'm going to let it regrow, right? And that 50% use that we're aiming towards is really of the entire year's growth. So you can have 80% use for a short period of time, but it's still not going to be 50% of the total grass growth over the year. But I think that whole idea came from how do I take that half, every blade of that half that I can. And, we now know, like you were just talking about with wildlife, that having that really even use is not ideal for lots of critters, right? We want inner canopy space. We want varying heights of plants. We want differences for our plants. And when we're thinking about grazing, our cows are looking for the youngest vegetation. So they're going to pick new blades. And if you have mixture of old grass that was dormant from the winter mixed in with new grass from this year, they're naturally just going to graze at different levels. The easiest way to get things even is to burn it and have all new regrowth. And then they're going to be less choosy about the plant species that they're selecting for, because everything is more similar in quality. But I think just how our ideas about grazing management have changed over the years is that we've recognized that having everything even isn't ideal for lots of animals. And it's really difficult to do with any kind of grazer, because they just don't want to graze that way. That's not how they select.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and they're and forcing animals to eat lower quality forage that hasn't been utilized, and forcing that in again, that's where I think we go in and see a lot of that reduction in animal performance especially on the rotational systems and stuff, because again, you're forcing them to eat stuff that they're not really, they don't really want to eat.
Yeah.
And it's lower quality.
No, go ahead.
Long rest is a good thing for plants, but it's not a good thing for what the cows want, right? So like if you have a long period of rest on an area, and then the cows come back in there and you've got hip high little blue stem, well, none of that's desirable to them, so not till things start to green up. And so you're pushing them to eat stuff that's dormant and very low quality, and you better be providing a protein supplement, because they can't digest that efficiently without it. And so it's difficult to provide rest but also have quality. And so that's why like our patch burning system has worked so well, is because we're taking we've got multiple years of rest before we burn something, and then we burn it, and that's what draws the grazing. And so, and you can do that on a full pasture too. You could burn off the whole pasture, and then everything is going to be higher quality, and they're not going to have to graze the older, dormant grass that is 4% crude protein and really, really horrible digestibility, So
I guess next thing is so how would someone figure out what is the stocking rate on my property? What is the correct way to do it? How, and I know there's lots of different ways to do it. There's also people that are out there to help us get that, and just talk about that. How do we figure it?
Yeah. So the best way for native pasture is to use a grazing exclosure. And a lot of people don't want to do this, but I really do feel like it's one of the most useful tools just to at least see what the production potential of your pasture is. So what we do is before everything starts to green up in the spring, so in February, so go ahead and put up a cattle panel with some T-posts, just make a ring with it, and you try to put it up in an area that looks similar to the rest of the pasture. So you don't try to pick an area that's growing lots of grass or not very much grass. Just pick an area that looks typical. You put up that grazing exclosure. Ideally, you're putting that up after you've either burned through it or you've weed eat down the area that you're going to put that, or you could brush hog or whatever. You just need to have you just want the vegetation for 1 year, so you don't want multiple years. So you put that up, you leave it up all summer. It's just keeping animals from grazing it, because we want to measure how much is our pasture growing in the absence of grazing. We don't want to measure what's left after grazing. That's a different question. So, and then in the fall, after the first killing frost, we can go in there and we can actually just clip and figure out how much our pasture's growing. So that's, I like to do it that way because native pasture has a lot of variability. So you might have big blue stem growing next to, some sand love grass or whatever. You can have a lot of variability in the productivity of different species, and so that helps to capture it. So we try to clip instead of using a grazing stick. In planted forages, you can use a grazing stick because the relationship between a Bermuda grass plant height, if you know the height and the density of the vegetation, you can predict how many pounds per acre it's growing, because it's just one species. There's not a lot of availability. So you can do that for fescue and for Bermuda and any of the planted forages, but you can't do it easily for native. So we clip. I use a ring. It's 0.96 square feet is the area of that ring. If you take an old hose, I don't know about other people, we have old busted up hose at our house all the time. So if you take old hose and a hose clamp and you measure it 41 inches, you clamp that hose into a ring, that will make this size ring. And then you're going to just clip everything to the ground. You wouldn't include anything that's woody because that's really heavy and we don't want to throw off the weight with that. But anything, we don't try to pick what grasses they're going to eat or not going to eat, and we throw the forbs in there. We put all of that into a bag and we weigh it. And typically we want that to be dry. So there's videos and stuff about how to dry forages in your microwave. At minimum, put it in your truck on a hot sunny day, and in a couple days it'll be pretty dry. So we're trying to get a weight.
And it's typically a paper sack too, because plastic sacks will
mold.
Yeah, mold. It'll hold moisture.
Yeah,
you want it something that'll breathe and allow that moisture to escape. And get out.
Good point, John. Yeah, if you put it in a Walmart sack or whatever,
Ziploc bag, you're in trouble.
Leave it open so that moisture can get out of there, because it will mold. And so somebody figured out, I don't know who found this up, but the size of the hoop. If you clipped 100 of these hoops, and totaled the weight, that weight in grams per square foot is equal to the pounds per acre that your pasture will grow. So you clip 100 of those, no one's going to do that. But if you clipped 100 and added that weight, that would be your pounds per acre, that what you weighed in grams. So if you clipped 4 of them, then you'd add the weight of those 4, and then you multiply by 25 to get to that pounds per acre. Or if you clipped 5 of them, you'd add the weight of those 5 and multiply by 20 to get to the pounds per acre. So that's how you can get pounds per acre production on your pasture. So that's what I teach in, like, we had a grazing school, and we teach it at the cow-calf boot camp and that kind of thing. So that's how you measure productivity.
How many do you recommend, like at a minimum?
Yeah, so
folks do.
It depends on how variable the pasture is, but within a 12-foot cattle panel, if you get a 12-foot or a 16-foot cattle panel, you can usually fit 4 or 5 hoops. So you try to get as many in that exclosure as you can. Ideally, you'd put up more than one exclosure. If you have, you'd put these, put them up in different locations depending on how variable the pasture is. I mean, for research, we do hundreds of them, but if you would be willing to do it, have the time, I would put at least 3 up on your property. Depends on how big the property is, but and then you want to do this for multiple years, because the reality is, here in the state, we can have huge swings. We can grow 125, 130% of normal, or we could grow 60% of normal. And so you don't know what your year is going to be. So we try to get as much of that, as many years as possible, to try to figure out what our pasture grows. There's other tools for getting an estimate on productivity. The web soil survey that the Natural Resource Conservation Service has, they have estimates for productivity based on the soil type and where you're located in the country. So in the web soil survey, you can go in there and outline your pasture or your whole property. It'll give you the soil map, and then based on that soil map, they'll give an estimate on the average year productivity. We have a fact sheet about how to do that whole process. I would say the downside of using a tool like that is that it's estimating that things are open, that there's not a bunch of trees covering things. So if you have a forested area in your pasture, you're going to have to reduce the acres that you're saying. If it says it's growing 3,200 pounds per acre, but you've got 15 acres that are covered in trees, you just need to cut those out of that calculation.
I believe on that web soil survey too, they have 3 different estimates. One for a really wet period, a high production, then they've got like an average over time, and then they also have below average kind of rainfall, so you can get that that kind of estimate. It gives you at least those, and those are long terms too, because they've been taken over a long period of time.
Yeah, they use a minimum of 30 years of data for those estimates, so it's good information. So that's kind of what we used for a long time within the discipline.
So would you also recommend, you talked about the exclosures and going in and clipping those exclosures. Would you also recommend people going out and clipping outside their exclosure? If
you want to make an estimate if you want to figure out how much you're actually using, your utilization rate, you clip outside of the exclosure. And what you're clipping is what's left. So basically you're going to take what's the pounds per acre that's left and divide it by the productivity that you have. And then you'd subtract that from 1 to figure out how much you took. And so that's, that you could do that in lots of locations around your pasture. And, you can figure out which areas they're focusing more. You might be able to visually see that as well, but you could also measure it if you'd like to. And then, you can do different things to try to change that distribution. So we like protein supplements the easiest, because everybody's providing protein supplement in the winter. They're going to have to do it somewhere. So pick a spot that they're not using as much, because they will start to use that area then after they get the cubes or whatever type of protein supplement you provide, they're going to graze on their way afterwards. And so that's the easiest way to change up distribution. You can use salt or mineral supplements. That works really, really well as well. And then there's the expensive fire. Burning areas. We did a study in south of Clinton by Bessie where we burned areas that animals avoided and increased their use of those avoided areas by 10 times.
Also, other work shown that fire was the number 1 attractor of livestock grazing over shade, mineral, water was a big driving too. So again, if you got areas that they're not utilizing.
Yeah, even areas far from water. you can increase their use of areas pretty far from water. We typically think of cattle will use areas up to a mile from water with minimal decreases in use, but then you start to get their use starts to drop off, and but you can use fire to try to attract them.
Yeah, we had that study years ago up in northwest Oklahoma. We had some areas, I think almost 2 miles from water, small areas that we burned, and the cattle were traveling to those burn areas and then would travel back 2 miles to water.
Yeah.
On that. It's huge attractant.
Yeah.
Within that.
It's pretty cool.
And there's also some other tools that we can use to estimate utilization. The newer one being the RAP tool.
Yeah. So the RAP tool is fantastic because so it's using satellite imagery to give you an estimate. So it originally was developed for just looking at cover. So how much of the area is covered by different plant groups. So it had perennial grasses and forbs. So everything that's living for more than 1 year, grasses and forbs lumped together, and then annual grasses and forbs, and then it had shrubs and trees and bare ground.
I guess before we get too far, I guess it'd be good for a lot of people that don't know what the RAP tool is. What is it and where's it found?
Yeah, good point. So it's called the Rangeland Analysis Platform, and it's a web-based app. So it's just online. You don't have to download anything or use an email or anything. You just go to the web page, and you can outline your whole property or a pasture. And so it was originally just had cover, but then they added a biomass estimate. And so they have models that use information about, so they're looking at when plants are greening up, how long that green up is lasting, and all of those things. And then they pair that information with information about historical productivity in different areas from some of the long-term monitoring that's been done by different federal agencies. So they can match that information up and give you an estimate of production. And so every 16 days, the satellite's coming around. And so that information updates every 16 days. And so you can look at what curve am I fitting to? Am I fitting to average productivity? Am I at 75% of normal, 50% of normal, 125%, whatever? So you can get an estimate of kind of where you're fitting for the current year. It also is discounting the acres that have heavy tree cover. So the perennial grass and forb biomass estimate will be lower on the acres that have that high tree cover. So anyway, so it's taking into account. So it's just one last step for folks that have, they don't have to take that out. It also has a stocking rate. So it has this tool that's called the Production Explorer. So when you go to the Rangeland Analysis website, Rangeland Analysis Platform website, you can go to the Production Explorer tool. That's where it's going to give you historical productivity. So it gives you an estimate of productivity for back to 1986, I believe. It will give you current year's productivity, where you're at as far as grass growth, grass and forb growth, and then it will give you, there's a stocking rate calculator. So you could put in, if you delineated your pasture, you could put in, I'm going to graze this size cattle on this property. This is what I think that they're going to consume daily. Usually we think about 2 to 2.5% of their body weight is what they're going to consume. And then based on the production estimate it's giving you, it will tell you how many animals it could graze for the set period of time that you say. So if you say, I'm going to graze them for 4 months and there are 6 months or 8 months or whatever, it will give you the number of animals that it could graze in that pasture. So super helpful tool that does all the math, right? And it's giving a production estimate. So you're not having to go out and clip.
There's much clipping. You said something there that's I think very important to stocking rates, and it's something, because a lot of times I hear people, their key is well, you know, my dad ran this many head on this property, or grandpa ran this many head on this property, so I can run it. But we have to think back, years back, as we've increased in time, the size of cattle have increased in size. Yeah. You know, grandpa ran 900 to 1,000 pound cows, and you're now running 1,500 to 1,600 pound. And so you said that with that production explorer. Yeah, that's a key, is size of animal that's going in. Why is that important to know about the size of the animal?
Yeah, you enter the weight of the cattle that you're putting in, and you're 100% right, John. People have kept the same number of animals that were grazed, but their cows are all bigger, right? And so if 1,000 pound so the standard for range management was 1,000 pound cow. Well, nobody has 1,000 pound cows pretty much anymore. So mature cows are 1,400 pounds something. And if a 1,000 pound animal is going to consume 26 pounds per day, and then if you move up to a 1,200 or 1,300, they're going to consume 30 something pounds per day. And so every day it's not a huge increase, but over the course of a month, it's a significant increase. And over the course of 6 months, it's a really large increase. And so that has changed. And then increased tree cover on many of our Oklahoma pastures has made fewer acres. You know, the acres are less productive than they used to be. So both of those things are pinching the forage base that we have as far as stocking rate goes. And so, yeah, you're right, John. I think always reevaluating that is a good idea. The Natural Resource Conservation Service can help with grazing management as well. They often write grazing plans. And so that's another option for folks that want some help with doing that. But yeah, reevaluating those regularly. And then with any grazing system that you pick, adaptive management is hugely important. So reevaluating where your forage base is midsummer can help you to start thinking about, am I going to move animals earlier? If I'm not growing as much, am I going to provide more supplemental hay? What are my options? Am I going to sell animals? What am I going to do to try to meet that? Or if you're growing more, it's awesome, then you might think about, maybe I'll retain ownership for a little bit longer on these calves after I wean them. Maybe I'll keep more replacement heifers, whatever you decide to do. But kind of having that plan earlier on in the year can be helpful for making good management decisions that can help you economically.
And it sounds like with a lot of this, I mean, there's increased flexibility if you choose to be conservative with your stocking rates as opposed to, being more aggressive with them. And it's reminded me of a kind of a similar thing in wildlife management. We have maximum sustained yield. For the longest time, people thought, if we just have the most animals out there at any given time, that's going to increase the number that we could harvest. It's why historically we didn't shoot does. We allowed female deer to live, but over time we recognized that actually your reproductive output decreases so much if you have the maximum number of animals out there and you maximize carrying capacity. And so maximum sustained yield, or the place at which we could harvest the most animals, is actually at about 50% of carrying capacity. So it kind of, when you said the 50% forage utilization, it kind of reminded me of that, because it's like, if you're not if you don't have too many animals out there on the landscape, you're just freeing up more resources for and then obviously if you have a good rain year, then you can just bump that number up a little bit. Yeah,
I think you bring up a good point. There's actually been some really interesting economic research on that very topic. And with cow-calf operations, it's difficult because, so say you go into a drought year and you have to destock by a certain percentage. You're selling animals when they're worth less when you sell them during a drought. And so then then when you come back out of the drought, there's there's lots of options. So you can either buy bred heifers or bred cows. They're going to be worth more because everybody else is also buying those. You can try to raise more replacements, which takes time. You're investing in those cows, for multiple years before you're getting something from her. And so either way, that up and down that happens because of drought for a cow-calf operation has long-term economic impacts. So there's some research that shows that a drought can impact the economics of a ranch for up to 7 years. And so we making the right decision during that is huge. So what some economists have shown is that actually keeping like a base herd of a much lower number than your carrying capacity is for cow-calf, and then fluctuating those numbers with stockers or retained ownership or something else is actually a better long-term decision, because you're not you're not chasing that number with the cows. You're fluctuating that number with something that's more liquid. So there's more risk with stockers, but there's more ease in changing up the numbers that you have. And so the long-term profitability of the operations that do both of those things is higher if you're doing that versus just strictly cow-calf. So yeah, and something you brought up, I said taking 50%. So often with range management, I'm sure this was what you were taught when you were in school originally, certainly what I was taught is like take half, leave half was the thing that everybody said with grazing. But we know that if the cows actually legitimately took half of the plant material, there's not going to be 50% left because the cows aren't 100% efficient in taking that half. So if your goal is, there's going to be loss, there's wildlife use, there's grass turnover that, there's some that's blown to the next 3 counties in Oklahoma, whatever. Things happen with that grass. But so the goal when we're setting a stocking rate is to use about 25% of the available productivity. So if it's 4,000 pounds per acre that you're growing, you're going to claim 1,000 pounds of that to go into the cow. About 1,000 will be lost to the environment or go back into the soil or whatever, and then 50% remains with the plant. And so that's what we call harvest efficiency. And so when we do our stocking rates, that's what we would use. And so anyway, you reminded me about that when you were talking about some of this wildlife stuff.
Yeah. And, the other thing on stocking rate is that's the deal. You can't figure stocking rate on the good years. You have got to figure stocking rate on the bad years, because that's what you're trying to manage for. And again, and I've seen it over time, all the good land managers, all the good ranches, they don't figure stocking rate on the good years. They figure stocking rate. This is what I can do year in, year out. Don't matter if it rains. I'm supposed to get 25 inches of rain every year. Well, we got 40 this year, and then next year we get 10.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that averages to 25 or whatever. Mm-hmm. But we've got to manage for the drought, for those dry years, because again, you don't want to be the one selling off all the time. You're always constantly selling off because you got too many head out there. Your stocking rate is not adjusted right. Yeah. And doing that, and that's a huge.
Well, in that 25%, it helps to build in a fair amount of conservatism into that. So like we're clipping everything to the ground when we're estimating productivity. They're not going to eat all of that. Well, that 25, saying we're going to take 25% of that helps to build in that conservatism. It also builds in conservatism on the side of like, we're going to have these year-to-year fluctuation. So for a stocking, I just want to say how you would calculate a stocking rate in case anybody wants to try it. You take your pounds per acre that your pasture produces, you multiply it times the number of acres, and then you multiply it times that harvest efficiency, that 0.25. So that's the total available forage that I get to use for my cows. That's that total number. So that's the top portion of a stocking rate calculation. And then the bottom portion is what the animal needs. So we've got what we can take from the pasture and then what the animal needs. On the bottom side, we take 26 pounds per day for a 1,000-pound animal. Then we multiply it times what their animal unit equivalent is. So whatever, if we need to alter it that size, if it's a 1,300-pound animal, we can just multiply it times 1.3. If it's a 700-pound steer, we can multiply by 0.7. And then we multiply that times the number of animals that we're going to graze. So we can either do the number of days or the number of animals, depending on what information you have. So say you said, well, I need to use that pasture for 4 months. You'd multiply the number of days. So 120 days. And then so you take the available forage, divide it by what the animal need is, and that will tell you the number of animals. If you don't know the number of days, you just know I've got 20 cows, then you would multiply times 20 cows and it'll give you the number of days that you could graze those 20 cows. And so that's all the stocking rate calculation is. We have fact sheets about calculating stocking rate. We've done social media posts about how to calculate stocking rate as well. It's really not that hard. I think it's just, there's a lot of ways to do it and other people do it. I think this is the simplest. And it works really effectively. Otherwise, you can always use the wrap and it'll do it for you.
And the key to stocking rate is again, I think everybody's always into this, more is better. And they think the more cows I run, the more money I can make. And that's not it. Because the more cows you have out there, the more input costs you have. Mm-hmm. The more chances that you're overutilizing, where your potential overutilization can cause long-term degradation to the plant community mm-hmm. that's out there. Less weight gain, less weaning weights, mm-hmm. less body condition scores, having to put more input, having to feed hay. Again, a lot of times mm-hmm. there's no reason to feed hay in Oklahoma. Yeah. We're not in Montana. It doesn't snow for forever. Having that, being able to do that, how much you could reduce those input costs is huge. Because again, mm-hmm. that's the bottom line is the less we can do and let the land provide for it, the better off we are.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think there's kind of you don't have to feed hay. You can just calculate your stocking rate and graze a sustainable number of animals so you don't have to mess with all that. Then just do protein in the winter. That's all you got to do.
Protein's a limiting source.
Yep.
Plenty of energy left out there in all those standing grass, standing forages that are out there.
Yep, definitely.
Yep. Anything else with that on stocking rate? Again, no. It's a simple calculation, simple thing that can definitely give you a long-term benefits of doing that. We just don't think about it a lot of times.
Mm-hmm. We don't, but it's the number one grazing decision that you should make on your rangeland pastures is what is the correct stocking rate that's going to make this sustainable for this plant community. And it'll have long-term economic impacts on your operation. So super important.
And again, it impacts your wildlife interests if that's part of your goals of your property as well. Your fire portions of it, about when I can burn and how much I can burn, the ability of that. It impacts a lot of the decisions on there. That one decision impacts a lot of decisions on the land. Yep.
If you can get that thing right, you can do a lot of other really cool creative things, but that one's got to be right. So,
well, thank you for another great episode of Blazin, Grazin, and Other Wild Things.